Jehu, and he immediately leaves after giving him instructions that he is to destroy the house of Ahab and to destroy Jezebel. And the bulk of chapter 9 is Jehu going to Jezreel and dealing with these different people in Ahab's house. He kills Joram, the reigning king, who was Ahab's son. And he also kills Joram's nephew, Ahaziah, who happened to be king of Judah at the time. Ahaziah was the son of Jehoram of Judah, and I realize that there's an alternating Joram, Jehoram, that the text uses both names for both kings, and it gets incredibly confusing if you don't understand the context and who is are paying attention to that. But the king that dies in chapter 9 is Joram or Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of Judah. And they both die on the same day. Jehu shoots them both with arrows. And so both Israel and Judah now find their kings assassinated. And then Jehu comes to Jezreel, and when he enters the city, Jezebel paints her face and kind of makes some snarky comments to him about him being Zimri, his master's murderer. And in response, Jehu asks her servants to throw her down, which they are only too happy to oblige. They throw her from the balcony window, and she is trampled underfoot by horses and chariots. It's pretty gruesome and brutal. But in both the death of Joram and in the death of Jezebel, Jehu has a tendency to cite fulfilled prophecy as his justification for what he is doing. In the case of Joram, he orders his men to throw the body into the property of Naboth the Jezreelite. And Jehu himself says in verses 25 and 26 of chapter 9, that I remember when you and I were riding together after Ahab his father, that the Lord laid this oracle against him. Surely I have seen yesterday the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons, says the Lord, and I will repay you in this property, says the Lord. Now then, take and cast him into the property according to the word of the Lord. Jehu was there, apparently, when Elijah gave his oracle to Ahab in 1 Kings 21, because I remember him saying that. And what a fitting place to exact vengeance on the house of Ahab. Where Ahab had killed Naboth, they now kill Joram and cast his body there. And the same goes with Jezebel. He cites prophetic justification for that as well. He orders his servants to go bury the body. They come back and say, there's not much body left. It's just her skull and her feet and her palms. And Jehu responds and says, well, this is the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, in the property of Jezreel, the dogs shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel will be as dung on the face of the field, in the property of Jezreel, so they cannot say, this is Jezebel. That's twice now Jehu cited prophetic justification for what he is doing. Which brings us to chapter 10. In chapter 10, Jehu isn't done. He's got more work to do in Ahab's family. And now that he's kind of taken over the king's second home at Jezreel, he turns his attention to the capital city of Samaria. And let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 11 of chapter 10. Can I get a volunteer to read 2 Kings 10, 1 through 11? Through verse 11, sorry. All right. Jehu has destroyed the house of Ahab at Jezreel, but now he has to deal with the family in Samaria. What is the purpose of Jehu's, this letter that he writes to the elders of Samaria? What's he trying to accomplish by that first letter? When he tells them to pick the best of your master's sons and set him on the throne, what's he trying to do here? Determine loyalty. It's kind of a challenge to pick sides. Basically, you might say, you're going to join with Joram and Ahab and his relatives, or are you going to join with me? And since the entire royal family is in Samaria, and it says Ahab has 70 sons, which although the word sons can sometimes mean just descendants in general. Still, it may suggest Ahab had multiple wives. I don't think Jezebel was that busy. But Jehu writes this letter to Samaria and all these elders and guardians of Ahab's sons. And he tells them, who are you going to join with? Since you got the royal family, since you've got the secure fortress, you have the chariots, you have the weapons, you have all of the advantages here, really. So all you got to do is pick the best of Ahab's sons and go ahead and stand up to me, right? The best and the fittest. The good and the right. Let this good and right king be done for Ahab's house, you might argue. Well, of course, how did the elders respond to that challenge? Yeah. How can we stand up to him, right? They're kind of afraid because they've already lost Joram. And the king of Judah is already dead too. So if those guys couldn't defeat Jehu, what leader can? The elders send their own letter in response, and instead of saying who they're going to put on the throne, they pledge their loyalty to him. We'll do everything you say. We won't appoint any kings, any more kings here. And in verse 4 they said, Verse 5, at the end of verse 5, they say, do what is good in your sight. Do what is right in your eyes. Kind of a catchphrase that pops up sometimes in the book of Judges, for instance. But in other places too. Do what is right in your eyes, Jehu. Do whatever you want. Well, Jehu responds with his second letter. It says, okay, if you are really loyal to me, then take the heads of the men and come meet me at Jezreel. Now that expression, take the heads of the men, come meet me at Jezreel, that's a little bit grammatically ambiguous. Like for instance in Deuteronomy 1, the Lord tells Moses, all right, take the heads of the tribes and point them over this group here. It's just, he's not telling him to decapitate anybody. He's just saying, take the leaders, bring them here. Jehu says, take the heads of the men, bring them to me. Now you could interpret that one way and say, oh, well, he just wants to have a meeting of all the rulers and the leaders. But is that how the elders interpret his statement? They take the heads of the men off of them, decapitate them, and send Jehu the heads, is what they do. And it's kind of an interesting ambiguity because it allows Jehu a little bit later to kind of play, I didn't know this was going to happen. Well, it was exactly what he had planned, but So the elders respond by killing all of Ahab's 70 sons and putting their heads in baskets. And then they send the baskets to Jehu in Jezreel. And there's kind of a little bit of a equal retribution, a just desserts thing going on here. Because, Ahab and Jezebel, they orchestrated the death of Naboth by sending letters to back and forth with the elders of Jezreel. Jehu orchestrates the death of Ahab's sons by sending letters back and forth with the elders of Samaria. And so this kind of, what goes around comes around for Ahab's family. And then a messenger informs Jehu, hey, there's a big pile of heads outside the city. Jehu says, leave the heads in heaps at the gates to be discovered in the morning. Verse 8. And in the morning they wake up and they find the heads. And Jehu says, who? Me? You think where did this come from? Right? Why? First of all, why does Jehu act that way? Like he doesn't know what's going on. Does that have anything to do with this? How does Jehu explain the death of Ahab's sons? Let's ask that. Yeah. So basically, Jehu goes back to the same justification he's been using all along in chapter 9. This is what the Lord said was going to happen. In verse 10, he says, know then that there shall fall to the earth nothing of the word of the Lord, which the Lord spoke concerning the house of Ahab, for the Lord has done what he spoke through his servant Elijah. In verse 9, he makes the point, I conspired against my master and killed him. Who killed all these? Well, Jehu technically did have a conspiracy going on. He knows that. But he didn't technically kill these 70. And their appearance at this doorstep, kind of leaves this great mystery. This who done it, who killed them. But Jehu makes the point, we really know who killed them. The Lord killed them. At the end of the day, the Lord needs to get the credit for all of this. So even though Jehu was too, quote, modest to take credit for the killings, the narrator gives it to him anyway in verse 11 and says that Jehu did in fact kill all who remained of the house of Ahab in Jezreel. This is how Jehu killed those who remained of the house of Ahab. Jehu's carnage extends to Ahab's, in verse 11, his great men, his acquaintances, his priests. And 3 times in this chapter, actually, the text emphasizes the lack of survivors. In verse 11, it says that he left him without a survivor. He left the house of Ahab without a survivor. In verse 14, there's no survivors from Ahaziah's brothers. In verse 25, there are going to be no survivors from the worshippers of Baal. So this is how Jehu orchestrates the remainder of the destruction in Ahab's house. But he gives the Lord credit for it. Any questions down to verse 11? Verse 12, he arose and departed and went to Samaria. On the way, while he was at Beth-Eked of the shepherds, Jehu met the relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah, and said, who are you? And they answered, we are the relatives of Ahaziah, and we have come down to greet the sons of the king and the sons of the queen mother. He said, take them alive. So they took them alive and killed them at the pit of Beth-Eked. 42 men, he left none of them. There's a little, again, this is one of those instances where humor doesn't come across in translation, but the Hebrew text is kind of expressing this irony. They took them alive and killed them. This back and forth. Well, isn't that the opposite of taking someone alive? But these are Ahaziah's 42 brothers or 42 relatives, however you want to translate that. Why are Ahaziah's relatives killed? Why did these guys get killed? Huh? Well, they're also part of the house of David, actually. They're relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah. Now there's this entanglement, as we talked about before, between the house of Ahab and the house of David. This relationship because of the marriage between Athaliah and Joram. Which we'll have more to say about in chapter 11. So that's part of it. certainly. We think about this. Do they seem to be aware of what Jehu's been doing for the last couple of days? It doesn't seem like that anyway. They're unaware of Jehu's exploits. But why? What are these relatives of Ahaziah doing? What are they on their way to do? The sons of the king and the sons of the queen mother. Who are those people? Who do they mean by king? They mean Ahab. They mean by the queen mother. They're talking about Jezebel. They probably mean more specifically Joram, Ahab's son Joram, but for all they knew, they thought he was king. They're going to greet them. 42 men killed in the pit of Beth-Eked. And, the text describes this event without comment, but there's several points that can be made. Number one, of course, as Tom's already pointed out, the Judean family, the family of David, is entangled in the house of Ahab. And so they really are, since they are part of the house of Ahab, they are joining in his fate. This whole thing would not have happened if Jehoshaphat hadn't a long time ago made a decision to marry off his son to Ahab's daughter, Athaliah. So by intermarrying the house of David with the house of Ahab, the house of David gets into very real danger of being destroyed along with the house of Ahab. And so as readers, we're kind of in suspense. Throughout 1 Kings, throughout 2 Kings, there's this talk about the lamp of David. How the Lord wants to maintain a lamp for David in Jerusalem. But we keep seeing people from the house of David get killed off, and it doesn't stop. There's more of this in chapter 11. So as readers, we're kind of in suspense. What about the promise to David? What about the lamp that the Lord always wanted to have in Jerusalem? Is it going to be extinguished? Is it going to be put out? So this is the problem here. Jehu is not in the mood to spare people who are loyal to Ahab's house. And some people criticize what Jehu does here and says, he's just going too far. Which we will talk about that towards the end of the chapter. This idea of whether or not Jehu goes too far in his violence against the house of Ahab. But, the thing here is, it's just like in chapter 9, he kills Ahab's son and Ahaziah. In chapter 10, he kills Ahab's sons relatives basically, and Ahaziah's relatives. It's a mirror image of what's going on in chapter 9. And so if, chapter 9 justifies Ahab's actions against Joram and Ahaziah, and chapter 10 would justify his actions against Ahab's sons and Ahaziah's brothers. So this is what happens when people are not loyal to the Lord, but rather loyal to a king who is a Baal worshiper. By contrast with Ahaziah's relatives, now Jehu's not the sort to kill everybody he meets, because in verse 15, he departs from there and meets Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him. And he greets him and said to him, "Is your heart as my heart is with your heart? Or is your heart right as my heart is with your heart?" And Jehonadab answered, "It is." Jehu said, "If it is, give me your hand." He gave him his hand. He took him up to his chariot. And he said, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." So he made him ride in his chariot. And when he came to Samaria, he killed all who remained to Ahab in Samaria until he had destroyed them according to the word of the Lord which he spoke to Elijah. There's more prophetic justification there. Who is Jehonadab, the son of Rechab? Who is this guy? A question handout tells you who to look for. We don't really see much of this guy elsewhere in Kings. We don't know much. We've never read about him before up to this point. There's really only one major mention of him in the Bible after this point, too, in Jeremiah chapter 35. In Jeremiah 35 is this much later Israel's history, whenever Judah is under siege from the Babylonians. And Jeremiah, this is the word of the Lord which came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, saying, "Go to the house of the Rechabites and speak to them, and bring them into the house of the Lord, into one of the chambers, and give them wine to drink." I took Jaazaniah, the son of Jeremiah, and the son of Habazaniah, and his brothers, and all his sons, and the whole house of the Rechabites. I brought them into the house of the Lord, into the chamber of the sons of Hanan, the son of Igdaliah, the man of God, which was near the chamber of the officials, which was above the chamber of Maaseiah, the son of Shallum, the doorkeeper. Then I set before the men of the house of the Rechabites pitchers full of wine and cups, and I said to them, drink wine. But they said, we will not drink wine, for Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, commanded us, saying, you shall not drink wine, you or your sons, forever. You shall not build a house, you shall not sow seed, you shall not plant a vineyard or own one, but in tents you shall dwell all your days, that you may live many days in the land where you sojourn. We have obeyed the voice of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, in all that he commanded us, not to drink wine all our days, we, our wives, our sons, or our daughters, not to build our houses to dwell in. We do not have vineyard or field or seed. We have only dwelt in tents, and we have obeyed and done according to all that Jonadab, our father, commanded us. But when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against the land, we said, come and let us go to Jerusalem before the army of the Chaldeans and before the army of the Arameans. So we have dwelt in Jerusalem. And Jeremiah goes on to describe, to explain the situation, that because the sons of Jehonadab, or Jonadab, are so loyal to their father's word, they will be blessed perpetually for that reason. And he contrasts them with the sons of Israel, who are not loyal to God, their father's word. But of course, this guy, Jonadab, or Jehonadab, you can see that little variant spelling there that's similar to Joram, Jehoram, Joash, Jehoash. Jonadab was first affiliated with Jehu and was apparently loyal to the true God, the Lord, in Samaria. So this is just kind of an interesting thing. He just gets a passing mention in 2 Kings as someone who wants to see Jehu's zeal for the Lord. But we go on Jeremiah 35 and we see that his sons have a zeal for following his word, a determination to do his will, that God looks at and holds up and says, this is how people should behave. So it's just kind of interesting to note that connection. Jehonadab, the son of Rechab. The other thing, we talk about Jehu's zeal for God. It's kind of like Phinehas in Numbers 25, who is so zealous for God that he impales the couple with a spear that is committing fornication in Israel. We need to be clear at this point. The narrator expects us to root for Jehu. And we don't learn about Jehu's shortcomings until later in the text. In fact, the narrator is setting us up to be disappointed when we get all the way down to verse 29, but that's coming up. But right now, it's kind of like maybe Jehu is this Phinehas type figure. Maybe he's this one who's zealous for the Lord in a time where people are kind of stagnant and just not really caring about God's will. Maybe Jehu's the guy to turn this around. Maybe he's the one to get that perpetual blessing from the Lord. And so, as readers, we're hopeful. This is the guy that might turn Israel around. A potential hope. He goes to Samaria, he kills everyone that belongs to Ahab, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke to Elijah. Jehu is again acting in obedience with God's word and God's prophecy. Then we come to verse 18. Verses 18 through 28. This is one of the more interesting stories in the Bible. Can I get a volunteer to read verses 18 through 28? Go ahead. Right. So Jehu shows up to Samaria, and the first thing he does is he pays a visit to Baal's temple, which Ahab set up. Remember back in 1 Kings 16, Ahab was the one that built Baal's temple. And then, we get a little surprise in verse 18. The reader might be surprised at this. Everybody else would surely have been surprised at it when Jehu makes an announcement. He says, Ahab only served Baal a little bit, but Jehu is going to serve him a lot. Now, is Jehu being serious when he says this? He's conspiring. Yeah, he's got a kind of a sneaky plan here. Baal is mentioned a lot in this chapter, and the Baal cult was so big in Israel at this time. We might wonder the question: how can Baal fail? And so, how is Jehu going to demonstrate? Of course, this comes right on the heels of the fact that in verse 16, Jehu said that he was zealous for Yahweh. So who's Jehu really zealous for? Is he zealous for Baal, or is he zealous for the Lord?
He is.
In the end, yeah. Of course, we're gonna get to verse 29 and find out he's really zealous for himself. But that's coming up. We're not supposed to read it that way yet. We're supposed to wait, because the narrator's setting us up. But you're right. Now, how are we going to celebrate our worship of Baal? We're going to have a big Baal worship service. That's what we're going to do. We're going to commemorate Jehu's rise to power with a newfound revival of Baal worship. And this doesn't really fit with anything else we've seen Jehu say in the story thus far. He's been citing prophetic fulfillment from Yahweh for everything. Now all of a sudden he's very interested in Baal. The text tells us explicitly in verse 19, Jehu did it in cunning. He did it in deception so that he might destroy the worshipers of Baal. And the key to this whole procedure, of course, is to make sure that every single person in Israel who likes Baal, who is loyal to Baal, is actually present. Priests, prophets, worshipers, everybody. We got to get them all here. And he threatens them. How does Jehu get everybody to show up? We'll have a special service. What happens if you don't show up? What happens if people don't show up? He threatens to kill them, right? Which, of course, there's a huge amount of irony because, the whole point of the service is to kill all of them. He says, if you don't show up, we're going to kill you. Well, the point is to get them there so that they can be killed. But this is apparently a very effective tactic because they sanctify a solemn assembly for Baal, verse 20, and they call the assembly. They send through all the worshipers of Baal in Israel. It says there was not a man left who did not come, verse 21. They go into the house of Baal, and the house is filled from one end to the other. They probably had to bring in special chairs to fill the aisle for this special service. Made sure that everyone in Israel who worships comes. And then, not only would they have to bring out special seating, they also have to bring out the special clothes in verse 22. The special garments for the worshipers of Baal. Why pass out the garments? So that they might be identified. So that it would be easier to spot them. The clothes are a tactical move to mark very obviously who is and is not a worshiper of Baal. Since it's being trumped as a big Baal party, of course, we want to express our confidence in Baal more in this way. And Jehu is there, and Jehonadab is there too. And they give orders, make sure that no one here is secretly a Yahweh worshiper, like Jehu is. Make sure no one here is actually a worshiper of the Lord. The only worshipers of Baal are allowed in here. And on the one hand, he's appealing to their Baalistic pride. But on the other hand, this is, of course, a part of the trap. They want to make sure that none of the innocents are swept away when they do this thing. And so they go in, they offer the sacrifice. Jehu, of course, has got 80 guys stationed outside, and on pain of death, they cannot permit anyone to escape in verse 24. And once the burnt offering is complete, in verse 25, they actually go ahead and offer the burnt offering. Verse 24 says they're going to offer a sacrifice and a burnt offering. Verse 24, they offer up the burnt offering, and then they turn the worshipers into the sacrifice. That's basically what happens. He burns the burnt offering and sacrifices the worshipers. And in verse 25, everybody inside is killed, and their bodies are thrown out. The sacred pillar of Baal is taken down so that they can burn it. The house of Baal is broken down and converted into a latrine, part of Jehu's temples to toilets program. Yeah, I did not come up with that line, but that's in summary, verse 28, Jehu eradicated Baal worship from Israel, which ends the apostasy that was started all the way back in 1 Kings chapter 16. Ahab's temple that he built in his glory days is now finally torn down. So 3 summaries in this chapter. Verse 11, Jehu kills all the house of Ahab in Jezreel. Verse 17, he kills all the house of Ahab in Samaria. And verse 28, he kills all of the Baal worshippers in Israel. Now, let's ask this question. Verse 7. Question 7. Question 7. Does Jehu go too far in his killings? He's a bit bloodthirsty, you're right. Did he go too far in his zeal for the Lord? You say no. Okay. And the text would agree with that assessment, actually. Because, and sometimes people will come in and they'll say Jehu went too far. That's not what happens next. What happens next is we learn he didn't go far enough. Look at verse 29. Verse 28, Jehu eradicated Baal out of Israel. Verse 29, however, as for the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin, from these Jehu did not depart, even the golden calves that were at Bethel and were at Dan. The message of the Bible isn't that Jehu goes too far. Instead, he didn't go far enough. And this is going to be a constant recurring problem with Jehu's house. Later, his grandson was told to fire arrows out the window, and Elisha gets mad at him. You didn't fire enough arrows. This is the whole problem. You don't do enough. The good thing we can say about Jehu is that he puts an end to Baal worship. At the same time, he stopped the Omride dynasty. He will not patronize Baal. He will not tolerate him. But Jehu doesn't do anything about the looming problem that's happened since the kingdom divided. Since the reign of Jeroboam. These 2 golden calves at Bethel and Dan. This false worship of Yahweh, and they would have called it Yahweh worship. So that's the most tragic statement about Jehu in verse 29. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam. He continued to worship the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. In response, verse 30, the Lord said to Jehu, because you have done well in executing what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the 4th generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. But Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, which he made Israel sin. So what's the final evaluation of Jehu's reign? What's the bottom line when it's all said and done? Yeah. It's kind of funny. Again, as readers, we get our hopes up. Because there's expressions used throughout Kings. If a ruler is good, they say he did what is right in the sight of the Lord. And if a ruler is bad, he does what is evil in the sight of the Lord. And if you read verse 30, the Lord shows up and says, you did what was right in my sight. So you think, Jehu is the only king of Israel whom that is said of. But, no. Just like Jeroboam at the end. Verse 31. Yeah. He did well, but for a man who cites God's prophecies over and over and over in chapters 9 and 10, and we've seen that quite a bit, for a man who claims to be zealous for God, he sure seemed to fall short in his love for God, didn't he? He did not walk in the law with all his heart. He did not depart from Jeroboam's sins. Yeah. And that's the problem. We can be right with the Lord in some ways and not in others. We can be We can do a few good things and then show up to the Lord and say, well, look at all this stuff I did for you. But you don't know Him. You don't know who the Lord is. It's this whole business again of, you didn't actually do the will of my Father who is in heaven. And Jehu is the very personification of what Jesus said in Matthew 7, verses 21 through 23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. In Matthew 7, in verse 22, he says that many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name cast out demons, in your name perform many miracles? Jehu could come in and say, well, Lord, Lord, didn't I defeat the house of Ahab? Didn't I avenge the blood of your servants the prophets? Didn't I eradicate Baal worship out of Israel? But Jesus says, I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Jehu, it says, was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord. Was by definition a lawless one. It was. Yeah. Oh, there's no question about that. The book of Kings has a lot of cautionary tales about people who went off the rails in their old age. I mean, Amaziah, Uzziah. But really, these are more Chronicles that emphasizes this idea. But Amaziah, Uzziah, Joash, all these guys, they do right for a little bit and then they get lackadaisical. They get complacent. When they're old age, they kind of just get, I did good enough. I don't need to do any more. That's not appropriate for people who follow the Lord. This isn't a sprint. It's a marathon. And it lasts a lifetime. Don't be like Jehu. Don't be like those other guys. Stick with it to the end. And in response to all of these things, and this is we're left with such disappointment, I guess, in reading this, because you see what God says to Jehu and you wonder, could it have been more? Could Jehu have been like the house of David? Could he? Yeah, he could have. What does God promise Jehu? A kingship. I'm going to build you a house, he had once said to David. He says, and he told David, your sons will sit on the throne forever. To Jehu, he says, your sons will sit on the throne to the 4th generation. So one way he's like David in that he's going to get to have his sons on the throne of Israel. And Jehu winds up having the longest dynasty in the history of northern Israel. It lasts over a century. But it's only for 4 generations. Not like David. It's not a permanent one. Now all this is going on while we're looking in chapter 11 at the house of David almost being extinguished. And we'll say more about that next time. But he did not depart from Jeroboam's sins. And we're left wondering, could Jehu have been so much more? Could he have done more? Could he have received more? Let's not put ourselves in Jehu's position, wondering in the last day, could I have been more? Could the Lord have given more to me? And even in Jehu's lifetime, some of the punishments start to land. In verses 32 and 33, in those days the Lord began to cut off portions from Israel, and Hazael defeated them throughout the territory of Israel, from the Jordan eastward, all the land of Gilead, the Gadites, the Reubenites, the Manassites, from Aroer, which is the valley of Arnon, even Gilead and Bashan. It teaches us something about God's justice. God begins to cut parts of Israel out. He allows the newly anointed king of Aram to attack Israel and to damage the nation. It says something about God's justice. Hazael was anointed in chapter 8. Jehu was anointed in chapter 9. God had Jehu's adversary picked out for him. Before Jehu ever got to the throne, before we ever knew what kind of king he was going to be, the Lord had already raised up the oppressor against him. The Arameans managed to conquer the Transjordan regions, Gad, Reuben, the half-tribe of Manasseh. Basically all those tribes that live east of the Jordan that were begging Moses in Numbers 32 and saying, we want to live east of the Jordan right here. It's so much better here. And they're the first ones to get cut off of Israel. So it doesn't end well for them. like Lot wanting to settle eastward in Sodom and the place that he thought was good, well, his time there gets cut a little short because that's where the judgment falls first. And what else is interesting about this, of course, is that in chapter 9, Jehu, when he was first anointed king, where was he stationed? Where was Jehu when he was anointed? He wasn't in Samaria. He was in Ramoth-Gilead, chapter 9. He was in Ramoth-Gilead, which is in that territory east of the Jordan. He's stationed there. He's fighting the Arameans and trying to take it back. And at the end of his reign, well, he doesn't control the city where he was anointed. That's for sure. Ramoth-Gilead was actually a city of refuge for Israel. And now he's lost that territory to the Arameans. Where Jehu was once an instrument of judgment, he now himself is judged. Even though he had worked for God and done mighty works in his name, he's ultimately condemned by God, rejected by God. And as for the rest of the acts of Jehu, all that he did and all his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? Jehu slept with his fathers. They buried him in Samaria. Jehoahaz his son became king in his place. The time which Jehu reigned over Israel in Samaria was 28 years. That was from 841 to 814 BC. Jehu's actually known to us in a little bit of secular history as well. In fact, this is a bit of random trivia. Jehu is the only king that we have a picture of, an actual bona fide picture of from the ancient world, because there's a black obelisk from Assyria. I should have made this part of a slideshow or something. There's a black obelisk from Assyria of Jehu paying tribute to Shalmaneser III, and they drew this carving of him on there. So Jehu is the one king of Israel that we actually know what he looked like. It's kind of interesting. But although it's an outline on a black obelisk, but still, what happens, of course, is that we have the lesson from Jehu is that just because we may do some things for the Lord and exhibit zeal for the Lord, if we don't stick with it and persist and hold fast to His word, well, then all of the other things that we've done for Him will be in vain. Let's not let that happen to us. That's chapter 10. Anybody else got any comments or questions? Yeah, it doesn't end well for Israel. Another point of interest that comes up, of course, in Hosea chapter 1. In Hosea 1 and verse 4, the Lord actually says He will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, which is kind of interesting. He throws that in there. And that's part of this justice of God, if you will, that the judgment, even though you are executing God's judgment, it can very easily be turned against you if you do not stay loyal to the Lord as well. So that's something that you see again and again in the prophets. And Hosea applies it specifically to the house of Jehu. So that's another thing to look at. Anything else? Thank you all for your attention. We'll pick up with chapter 11 on Thursday.